Good evening. Welcome to the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. I'm Jagjit Chadha, the Director of the Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to the second of our Festival of Social Science events this week. The Festival of Social Science is kindly sponsored by the Economic and Social Research Council. And one of the great things we've been able to do at the Institute is promote the work of social scientists, not only at the Institute, but in the broader community of the UK. And I think never more than this year has it been critical for us to combine as a community and address the very genuine and real problems that we face as a society. These, of course, have been exposed and highlighted by the terrible COVID crisis that we are living through still at the moment. And the work of social scientists, I know, has been powerfully influential in policymaking and has responded to some of the events that we've seen around us, both in terms of healthcare and the impact on families. But what this crisis has also revealed to so many people are the underlying weaknesses in many of our economic structures and institutions. And therefore, on that basis, I'm doubly delighted in this event today, which is the second annual Prais Lecture, to introduce David Sainsbury, Lord David Sainsbury, formerly Minister for Science and Innovation, and also currently the Chancellor of the University of Cambridge, who will be talking about his long-standing interest in productivity, what has now become known as the productivity puzzle. And I'm delighted to have him here with us today talking about his insights in this area. And he'll be talking in conversation with Sir Paul Tucker, who is the president of the National Institute of Economics and Social Research, elected some 2 years ago. You'll know him, of course, as man and boy at the Bank of England, where he left as Deputy Governor in 2013. And he subsequently chaired the Systemic Risk Council and has published a book that everyone should really read on unelected power and authority, and is working at Harvard at the moment, working on another book, the name of which I shan't reveal. I'll leave him to talk about later. And I'm also so pleased that this second annual Prais Lecture is again being supported by the Prais family. Because of course the work of SIG was a very important part of the Institute's development. The Institute, of course, was established in 1938, and SIG, wonderful though he was, didn't start working at the Institute in 1938, but his work dominated much of the activity of the Institute in developing an international reputation for work into prosperity. And it doesn't take you very long to realize that prosperity is very much linked to his insights and the work on human capital and education that he pioneered, as well as understanding how better management at plants and industrial organizations would also promote productivity. For he realized very early on that productivity is the thing that over the long run best promotes prosperity in an economy. And therefore we were very delighted as an institute, and me personally as director, that the Prais family felt honoured, but also delighted that we wanted to have this annual lecture in his honour. And I can think of no one better today than David Sainsbury, whose book, The Windows of Opportunity, I embarrassed myself by just saying a few months ago, I really enjoyed reading over the summer. And I was particularly pleased when I went to it that, in fact, right in the middle of it, he cites Sig Price's work. He says, in the 1980s, as part of a broad investigation into why there were large international differences in productivity. Note, David's talking about the 1980s. That could be a line repeated about the 1990s, the noughties, the 2010s, and the 2020s. This is a problem that has scarred post-war British performance. But he goes on to write into why there were large international differences in productivity. A study was made by Professor Sig Price and his team at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research of a series of matched manufacturing plants in industrial sectors as varied as clothing, furniture, and biscuits. One of my favorite things. These comparisons showed clearly how the lack of people with intermediate level skills led to lower productivity in British manufacturing plants. So it's not only that lasting insight we remember Sig for, but also many stories from Institute stalwarts that I can't possibly repeat in front of his family this evening, but at some other point in the future, I will look forward to doing so. So again, I want to thank the participants, but particularly David and Paul for joining us this evening, the ESRC and the Prais family. As is custom these days, the event can be followed on Twitter. You can hashtag. I think the hashtag is something like ESRC Festival. And you can ask questions through the chat function that Paul will pick up later on. But beware, there is a small cost to using the chat function. We may ask you to come online and speak your question directly to us as well. So if you're prepared to run that gauntlet, do send some questions in. If I may now turn to David Sainsbury to present his ideas on productivity. David.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. And I would like to begin by saying how delighted I am to be asked to give this lecture in honor of Professor Sig Prais. And this isn't the usual pleasant comment which is made on these occasions, but because, as you've already heard, I greatly admired his research, particularly in two specific areas. I also thought his research was exactly the sort of excellent empirical research that policymakers need but rarely get. The first area of research that greatly impressed me was the one that you've already heard about, which was his comparative studies of business growth in Britain and continental Europe that he did for the National Institute, and which led him to argue that British industry suffered from poor education and training in technical subjects relative to successful countries such as Germany and Switzerland. I read this piece of research with great interest, and it led to my lifelong interest in technical education. And when in 2016 I chaired the independent panel on technical education, which produced the report which the government is now using to reform technical education, I like to think that Professor Prais was looking down from heaven with approval. Then in 1994, Professor Prais undertook a comparative study of mathematics in primary schools. And on the strength of his findings, my charitable trust funded the National Institute to run a pilot project teaching numeracy using Swiss whole class methods in 6 schools in Barking and Dagenham. This was hugely successful and led eventually to David Blunkett introducing a national numeracy strategy requiring primary teachers to use whole class methods. I think, again, this is an example of how good empirical research can lead to desirable social change. I'd also like at the start of this talk to thank Rebecca Riley, Anna Rincon-Asna, and Leah Samek here at the National Institute for the invaluable help they gave me in producing the charts in my book, Windows of Opportunity, How Nations Create Wealth, on which this talk is based. I'd like now to turn to the subject of my talk, which is an explanation of the so-called productivity puzzle. In the period between 2010 and 2019, the UK had a very poor record of economic growth, with the annualized rate of growth and output per hour averaging just 0.4%. And the pandemic has, of course, made the situation worse. The economists who advise the government have not, however, been able to explain why our rate of growth has been so low, referring to it as a productivity puzzle, which is why I assume that the government has put £34 million into a productivity institute to try to find out why the UK has a low rate of economic growth. And of the first question is why the economists who advise the government can't explain our low rate of productivity growth. The answer is they can't, because most of them are neoclassical economists whose thinking about economic growth is based on a mathematical model of growth, which has built into it 3 assumptions which are completely unrealistic. They are that the capabilities of firms don't matter, and that we can think in terms of the representative firm, that firms are managed by rational managers, and that consequently entrepreneurs play no part, and that we're dealing with perfectly competitive markets where everyone is selling the same product or service at the same price. In such a world, the only variable left is the overall efficiency of the market, and the performance of firms is not a variable which can be used to explain the economic growth rate of countries. In these circumstances, we need, I believe, a new theory of economic growth. And in my book, Windows of Opportunity, How Nations Create Wealth, I've put forward what I've called a production capability theory of growth. This, I think, can, at a high level, explain why the UK had a slow rate of growth and why we have major regional inequalities, as well as suggesting the areas where we need new policies to improve the UK's performance. Before I describe the production capability theory of economic growth and show how it can be used to explain the UK's poor rate of growth, there is one technical issue which is important, I think, to understand. When economists talk about the productivity of the economy, they're not talking about production efficiency, as most business people think. They're not talking about the number of man-hours used to produce the economy's output. What they're talking about is the value added per capita of firms in the economy, inflation adjusted. This is important because the value added per capita of a firm depends not only on its production efficiency, but also its innovation and competitive advantage in the marketplace and the price it can charge its customers. This point is central to the production capability theory of economic growth, which I set out in my book. And if we look at the following chart, we can see that value added per capita varies between sectors, and that the UK's poor growth rate over the period covered by the chart can be explained by what happened in the different sectors of the economy and the shift of economic activity between them. What the chart shows is the changes in value added per capita of the different major sectors of the economy over the period 2010 to 2019. And what we see is that the slow growth rate was due to the performance of three major sectors of the economy: manufacturing, financial services, and oil and gas, and a shift in economic activity from high value added sectors to low value added sectors, as shown by a negative between effect of -2.4%. In the case of manufacturing, it suffered a fall in GVA from £55.73 to £52.20, and also saw a fall in its percentage share of total GVA from 10.64% to 9.65%. This was caused by firms in foreign countries rapidly innovating and increasing the competitive advantage of their manufacturing industries faster than our manufacturing industries were doing. In the case of financial services, which is one of the UK's high value-added services, the GVA per hour grew by 3.45% between 2010 and 2019. But as a percentage of the country's total GVA, it fell from 5.44% to 3.99%. The average revenues of the leading listed 4 UK banks fell by 17% between 2010 and 2019, as lower aggregate demand in the economy resulted in less demand for financial products. In addition, many of the financial products which had flourished in the boom conditions leading up to the financial crash were seen to have little economic value after the crash. And that's putting it rather politely, I think. Finally, the oil and gas sector saw a fall in GVA per hour from £681 per hour to £546 per hour, while in percentage share of the country's GVA, it fell from 1.51% to 0.72%. The latter figure was due to the fall in GVA per hour and a fall in output by a quarter from the end of 2010 to the end of 2019. This obviously had a significant impact on the growth rate of the UK And I think it's surprising in view of the importance to the national growth figures that so little attention has been paid by economists to the impact of North Sea oil. In summary, the reason we've had a slow rate of productivity growth in the UK is that because of global competition, the high value-added per sector, capita sectors of our economy are today a smaller share of our economy than in 2000. And the only way we can improve our rate of growth is by increasing the number and innovation and competitive advantage of firms in the high value-added sectors of our economy. The production capability theory of economic growth can also be used to explain the substantial regional inequalities we have in the UK. As work at the Centre for Cities has shown, this divide is not simply due to geography. It's not due to workers in the north working less hard than in the south or being less efficient. Nor is it the case that all cities in the north are less prosperous than those in the south. It is on the contrary due to the fact that only a few cities in the north who benefited from incubating the major industries of the Industrial Revolution have been able, in the face of fierce foreign competition, to reinvent themselves and move into today's high value-added per capita sectors. Government policies in the past, which have explicitly attempted to reduce the north-south divide, and which can be traced back to the 1930s, have not been effective because the majority of interventions have tended to reinforce the existing industrial structure by supporting low knowledge routine activities to reduce unemployment, as opposed to supporting the reinvention of cities by increasing the number of knowledge intensive businesses in them. As a result, in many cities in the north, jobs in declining industries have been replaced by low skilled routine jobs, which are vulnerable to foreign competition and technological change. Cotton mills and dockyards have been replaced by call centers and distribution sheds. What we need to do now urgently is create more high value added per capita firms and jobs in the lower income regions of the country. As I said, however, at the beginning of this presentation, the figures I've shown give only a high level of explanation of why the UK's rate of productivity growth has been slow. If the government is to be in a position to develop policies to improve the country's rate of economic growth, a deeper look needs to be taken at why UK firms have been slow in the face of fierce competition from foreign firms to innovate and create new competitive advantage in specific sectors. This suggests to me two further areas of research. Firstly, it's now possible to compare the value added per capita of UK firms in specific sectors with their competitors in other European countries, and then to ask why they differ. Is it because firms with higher value added in specific sectors are investing more in R&D? Or is it because they have a more skilled workforce? Or is it because the way that their executives are remunerated means that they take a longer term view? Secondly, there are a number of research projects which I think could be usefully undertaken and are not currently being done because they do not involve factors in the neoclassical model of economic growth. These are, firstly, why some cities have been able to reinvent themselves better than others. Why, for example, has Boston in America been able to reinvent itself again and again, starting, of course, in the early stages of industrialization in America, then changing, becoming a manufacturing center, then reinventing itself again and becoming a center for mini computers. And then when that wave passed to Silicon Valley, reinventing itself again and moving into a whole new range of industries like biotech. Secondly, what are the most effective institutions that other countries have developed to diffuse innovation to their firms? I'm thinking of organizations such as ITRI in Taiwan, Manufacturing Extension Partnerships in America, and the Fraunhofer Society in Germany. Thirdly, what can governments do to improve the innovative performance of firms in terms of governance, remuneration, and management skills? Finally, let me say, during the 8 years I was in government, one of the things that struck me most forcibly was how badly informed government was when it came to policy making. In particular, the government never seemed to know what successful policies other countries had in policy areas under the policy area under discussion. And even though there is no policy problem we have other than fox hunting, which other countries don't have also. So if we want to improve our rate of economic growth, we need more outstanding empirical research, such as Prais produced. And I hope in the future the National Institute will continue to diligently follow in his footsteps. Thank you very much.
Well, David, thank you very much to you, and thank you to the National Institute for hosting this opportunity. There are a few more important subjects, and yet I completely agree with you. The subject is obscured, barely talked about in Britain, and just two reflections on that. The first is there's rightly a lot of concern, increased concern over recent years about inequality. In a world with zero productivity growth per capita, everything is a zero-sum game. I can only be better off if everybody else is worse off. My part of the country can only be better off if other parts of the country are worse off. So that the politics with a small p, of addressing problems of inequality will be hugely greater with low productivity growth. The second thing I'd say is that there's a lot of debate now, of course, about the scale of the public debt. And of course it's right that with very low current and prospective interest rates, it will be easier to service than otherwise. But over the medium to long run, it would be a lot easier if robust productivity growth could resume. I think one of the things I'm hoping that will come out of our discussion, and perhaps out of the questions as well, is that this problem of low productivity growth isn't, of course, confined to the UK. It's pretty much afflicted the whole of the advanced economy world. And nevertheless, some countries are doing better than others. And so I'll come back to this later on. But I think the need to study what other countries are doing hasn't gone away, even though we have a shared problem. For the benefit of the economists that are watching this evening, I am not going to, or at least I'm going to try to not rise to the bait of David's provocations on neoclassical economics. I'm going to try to avoid us getting into the relevance of the work of Paul Romer or Philippe Aghion on creative destruction. Philippe's now based partly at the LSE, of André Schleifer's work, departing from rationality in the formation of expectations and applying that to boom and bust, or Ben Holmstrom's work on internal incentives. And the reason I'm not going to try to do that is that it kind of misses the point, which is that notwithstanding all of that work over the past 20 years or so, we do have a productivity problem, and it is serious, and it's been going on for quite a long time, plausibly for some years before the great financial crisis in 2007, 2008. But I did, in the first part of our conversation, want to put to you, just to see what you say actually, because I don't know what I think about it myself, some recent research on firms that is quite striking. So there is, earlier in the year, a British economist based at Stanford, Nick Bloom, published research, and I'm now quoting from an abstract of another paper, finding evidence for a substantial decline in research productivity in the United States economy over the past 40 years. And then more recently, a paper by some economists based, I think, in Europe, have replicated that for Germany and China. And I think you will have known more about R&D than I will ever learn. But if that work is robust, it's a striking thing that the generation of practical ideas in R&D would seem to have slowed down over the past 40 years. Just taking it at face value at the moment at that headline level, are you surprised by that? And do you have any thoughts as to what might explain it? And I'm sorry to kind of bounce you with thoughts like this, but I'm very interested with your experience of government and business and in sponsoring research institutes and think tanks, how you respond to this fact, which I find rather startling.
Well, Paul, can I slightly mischievously go back to the original point about not wanting to defend neoclassical economics? Because I was always, when I was writing this book, I asked myself, how will neoclassical economists respond to this? And being a kind of modest person, I thought they're just going to come up and say, look, you made a terrible mistake. You don't understand about value added per capita and so on. That thankfully has not happened. But you are doing what I think Ed Balls did on another occasion, which is to say, well, I really pretty much agree with you. And I think neoclassical economist is pretty much on the same lines now. I don't find this very convincing because what I've done in this, I think, is say, I can explain to you why there is a productivity puzzle. This is what it is. And this is because this is the way my theory works. If neoclassical economists really did agree with what I'm saying, then they should also be saying it. This is what the productivity puzzle is. This is why we have low productivity. And they shouldn't have to leave it to a non-economist like me to point out why there isn't a productivity puzzle. Because if you really understood this point, you should be earning your keep as economists by pointing out that the reason for productivity low is the reasons I'm giving, which are to do with competition and innovation.
Well, how would they respond to that? I think they probably say things like, well, the debate in Britain, of course, is worse than it is in the United States in this respect. And I would agree with that. I think they might talk about the particular challenges faced by a services-based economy. But I think their main response would be one of humility in terms of, well, however good the work that we've done over the past 20 years, we've got this problem, so we obviously haven't helped to cure it. And that's why I started with R&D, because it's up to a point. It's compelling to believe that R&D, effective R&D, must be part of the solution, and yet it seems to have become less productive itself. A decline in the productivity in R&D seems like a rather alarming thing in headline terms.
Well, let's just get back. Okay, let's just go back to the position in America. I've only got some figures on this, but I think you will see if you do the same analysis as I've done on the American economy, you'll see a very similar pattern.
Oh yes.
Basically, their manufacturing industry is not increasing its value added very significantly. There's been a huge increase in population, which I think people don't always totally understand. And a vast majority of the new jobs have gone into low value added services. And that's why there is a very low rate of growth of productivity. It's as simple as that. And it mirrors very exactly the situation in the UK. When it comes to R&D, I think the main story is not about the productivity of R&D. In America, it's simply that they've fallen away from the very high levels of R&D funding at a time when other countries, such as China particularly, but also countries like Taiwan and South Korea and so on, and Israel, have been pouring large amounts of money into R&D and are catching up with America in all sorts of areas of technology. That's the main story. Whether the productivity of the R&D is less or more, I think is probably rather difficult to compute, partly because it's not only a question of the R&D productivity, it's actually where that's been used, where it's been put. But the main story is just they're not doing enough R&D, and they're not taking a long-term view about investment in their businesses.
Can I turn to mergers and acquisitions? As you know, again, more in the US than in the UK, there's a very active debate about antitrust policy and whether, in all sorts of ways, antitrust policy may have been part of the problem as it is argued it's become more relaxed over recent decades, partly reflecting the kind of Chicago school influence. And the Federal Reserve recently published research looking at the effects of mergers and acquisitions on markups and productivity at plant level. And what they found, and again, I'm quoting from the abstract, this is a paper published in 2016 by Blonigan and Pierce, that they could find an effect on markups, which I assume means that when firms merge, they get a bit more extra pricing power. But they couldn't find little evidence for effects on plant level productivity. And that again, at a superficial level, that's extraordinary actually, if you think about the huge market in M&A. If M&A, particularly in the United States, if it doesn't generate improvements in efficiency, even at plant level, that would be quite something. And of course, very topical with a potential new administration in the United States, some of whose supporters at least have been arguing for a major change in antitrust policy. And I raise this because my own thoughts, and for some considerable years, going back well over a decade, is that it's most peculiar that in the United Kingdom, competition policy and the work of the Competition and Markets Authority is regularly discussed in terms of consumer protection, but seems rarely to be discussed in terms of the contribution it can make to the basic functioning and dynamism of the economy. And I was wondering whether, either with your business background or government background or the work you've done in recent years, you feel at all that competition policy could be part of the solution, or whether it's kind of even now part of the problem. And this is, of course, incredibly important given the changes coming at the beginning of next year in the UK's constitutional status.
I have to say, I don't quite know why there is an assumption that if you merge two big companies, you will get any plant efficiency from it. Because at the level we're talking at, probably the plants are at an economic level, and simply having two rather than one won't necessarily give you any production efficiency. I mean, if they're both reasonably well run, you just have two factories running at a level rather than one. So I don't think I don't think that's really surprising. But I think what's interesting about this is these suggestions as to why productivity is slow, they all stem from the basic kind of neoclassical way of thinking about these issues, which they are essentially issues of market efficiency. And I think market efficiency is important, but not all. The issue of productivity is not just an issue of market efficiency. It's also, and above all else, an issue to do with innovation and getting competitive advantage. And that's about performance of innovative companies. That's about company performance. And the trouble with a lot of neoclassical thinking is that the firm really doesn't play, I think I said this in my talk right at the beginning, the firm really doesn't play any part in this. It's an incredibly nebulous concept in neoclassical thinking. The firm is essentially some rational managers and some physical assets. The whole question of capabilities of firms, their ability to seize opportunities and turn it into innovation is just not one of the variables. And so neoclassical economists keep coming back on these issues of market efficiency. And there may be some issues of market efficiency, but I don't think that is remotely the big issue. The big issue is about innovation and achieving competitive advantage in a world of fierce competition from the developing countries.
I'm gradually going to try to progress away from implicitly neoclassical questions. Maybe this is a bit of a bridge. I shall come to cities in due course. Right. So as a potential bridge, a former colleague of mine expressed the view a few years ago, I think while he was still in office, and was that kind of part of the problem in Britain was that far too many talented people went into finance. And actually there was a kind of internal brain drain that had gone on. And I wondered whether, given that finance is potentially a high value added sector or industry, I wondered whether that was, well, I just wondered what you thought about that, really. I mean, it's certainly the case, I think, just if one has lived in Britain for the last 50 years or so, that more talented people now go into wholesale financial services than was the case 25, certainly 40 years ago. And the question is, has that been a good thing or a bad thing? I then want to ask a question about financial engineering, and then I'll come on to cities.
Well, I think the problem from policymaker is if you look at it in terms of the value added created by financial services, it's been hugely helpful to the British economy. If you just look at the figures I showed, they show a very high value added per capita for financial services. So that's entirely a good thing. In terms of its effect on the performance of companies, I think it's been an extremely negative one. I think a bit of it is that it has pulled an enormous amount of talent into the city, but that has created, after all, a lot of value added. What has been negative about it is that really for other reasons, not, the whole relationship between financing and businesses essentially, and the involvement in shareholders in the governance of companies has completely broken down. So, you know, if you go back before the war, or maybe go back 40 or 50 years, what you had is a whole lot of individual shareholders who invested their money in companies and were generally interested in the long-term creation of value. That world has disappeared. As you know, I'm sure the financial city now, the huge amount of activity goes through pension funds and other bodies, and that money is then invested by investment managers, and they have absolutely no interest in the long-term performance of the companies in which they're investing in, for various reasons, which have to do with the relationship with the investors. So you have a whole lot of things going on, like high-frequency trading, in which people make lots of money by investing for half an hour or 20 minutes in a business, but in no way are interested in long-term value creation. What they're interested in, to be honest, is value extraction. It's what they can get out of their shares over quite a short period. And I think this tends to mean that the governance of companies is rather bad, and they don't take a long-term view. In fact, they take a very short-term view. And while the position is not as bad as in America, where there is a huge amount of money which goes into share buybacks to keep investors happy, we have a bit of the same, but it's much more a smaller scale. That is actually very bad for performance. I mean, you've just got lots of people now. You look at, there was some very brilliant work done, I think, by Bill Lasonic, which was reported in the Harvard Business Review, which he showed over quite a long period. If you took the amount of buybacks and the dividend payments, it came to about 90% of the cash flow of businesses, leaving 10% only for reinvestment. And I have no doubt that has made the performance of companies worse.
Yeah, I think this is a profoundly important point that I don't know what the truth of it is, but I do think that it comes back time and time again in the British debate about finance, whether it's the Macmillan Committee, the Wilson Committee, and various debates over the past 20 years. I want to move to universities and cities, and then bridge from that to regional policy, which a member of the audience has asked about. You mentioned Boston, and as you rightly say, Boston and the city over the river, Cambridge, Massachusetts, are incredibly dynamic, and that's partly to do with the universities that are based in and around Cambridge and Boston. You were also, of course, Chancellor of the University of Cambridge, and just very impressionistically, my sense about the real Cambridge, Cambridge, England, is that it too has had a period of extraordinary dynamism and investment, and probably rise in living standards for people living there. And that, as with the other Cambridge in New England, that's partly down to investments made by the university, and indeed with a very long time horizon. John Bradfield's investments in the beginnings of the Science Park, when he was the bursar of Trinity, which I should declare I was an undergraduate, seems to be kind of remarkable, both in its long-term effects and in the patience of the investors and the university and city authorities in enabling that. And although you would know better than me, although perhaps not quite on the spectacular scale of Stamford and roundabouts, is nevertheless a mark of success. And I wondered whether you could say something about that, and then something about university cities, which is, and I thought I would just tell a short anecdote against myself, really. While I was writing my first book, I was invited to go and discuss the work I was doing with a number of people in different disciplines around the United States. And I visited some incredibly helpful political scientists in Pittsburgh, where I had never been before. And I carried around a prejudice that Pittsburgh would be a rather rundown town, given the decline of heavy industry there. Whereas in fact, it's a rather dynamic city. And I asked my hosts this, as they showed me a bit around town and as we talked and things. They said, oh, well, there kind of was a negative shock to economic activity in Pittsburgh, of course. But the city was supported by its enormous cultural capital, 2 universities, the Mellon Carnegie Center for the Arts, the orchestra. And then they talked about how more art galleries had opened and tech people had come there, and Heinz had moved their headquarters there or something. I'm going to get all the details wrong. But it opened my eyes to the extraordinary impact that in the broadest sense universities can have on not only the urban environment and the quality of life in towns and cities, but also kind of the economic dynamism of the region and a kind of spillovers to the rest of the economy. And that's a long question, which is trying to prompt you to say something about how you see what's happened in Cambridge over the last 20 years or so, and perhaps what lessons there might be for other university towns in Britain.
Yeah, I mean, this is almost my favorite subject. Actually, just to start with Pittsburgh, because Pittsburgh is really very interesting in this. I don't think it's particularly to do with the cultural side, but it's very much to do with the university side, because as I understand the story of Pittsburgh, of course, you had the devastation of the steel industry in Pittsburgh. And it went through quite a depressed period. And then you may remember it had a nuclear power station. And there was a famous disaster in it, in which the whole plant became radioactive and had to be shut down. And rather remarkably, a professor of robotics at Carnegie Mellon, with his students, developed a robot which could go into the radioactive plant and clean it up. And this became very important robotic knowledge and has led to a revival of work on robotics. They were helped in this because, of course, Carnegie Mellon was famously very good for artificial intelligence. And of course, artificial intelligence moves into the robotics industry, and then also now spills over into things like Uber. So Uber has its research, I think, headquarters in Pittsburgh, because it's again all part of using artificial intelligence.
Yes, I think, and just to intercept, just with a small point, which is that although that's the driver of economic prosperity, I think the contribution of the cultural institutions, at least as anecdotally I absorbed from my hosts, was that made it a nice place for them and their families to live. I mean, tenured university faculty can be quite footloose, and they're trying to find a place that is stimulating for them and also intellectually, but also agreeable to live. And I think all of these things may come together and reinforce each other.
Well, I think what was behind people's thinking on that, there was a theory of I think he was called Richard Florida, who had this theory of the creative classes, and that the way you got economic development was you attracted the creative classes to your city, that's how you got the prosperity. And there was a whole movement for a period of years of trying to attract creative people in this way. I think when you look at the evidence, it turns out it's the other way around, that you need, first of all, to get the creative people to come. And if they come, then actually the creative side of it usually follows afterwards. So I think that is the case. Going back to your more broader question, I think the situation in Boston, which I know better, there are three things which make for these cities and are particularly important in Boston. One, of course, is a highly skilled workforce because you have the universities, MIT and so on. The second is large injections of technology knowledge. So, of course, during the Second World War and during the Cold War, places like MIT got huge injections of federal funds, which enabled them to do an enormous amount of technology development and go into microelectronics and so on. And then, of course, the third thing in the case of Boston, it was really the birthplace of venture capital in America, with the president, I can't remember his name, of MIT, and of course, General Dorio, who was really the beginning, the funder, the starter of funding venture capital, being at Harvard. So you had those three ingredients: venture capital, highly skilled people, and technology, science and technology. And you put those three together, and you have cities that can reinvent themselves. And if you look at the other thing I think is interesting to look at this is there's some very interesting work looking at innovation in different countries, but that work has also been extended into all the states in America. And if you just take the amount of innovation in Massachusetts, it would make it probably the most innovative country in the world if you treat it as a country. And that, of course, is roughly what my book is about, which is the thing that drives competitive advantage is innovation, and it's competitive advantage that drives economic growth.
I would say this, of course, given how I spend part of my life, but I think it's tremendously useful, if I may say so, that you highlight what's been going on in Massachusetts. It isn't just a Silicon Valley West Coast story. Remarkable things have happened on parts of the East Coast as well. I want to bring in and link two questions asked by members of the audience. One is from Robert Morland, a former MEP, who wanted to ask about how regional policy fits into all of this, which I think has a connection with what we've just been discussing. And Kenny Richmond made the point, which I'm going to turn into my own words with more edge than he very politely delivered it, which is, it's all very well to talk about improving the share, increasing the share of high value added industries, but can't we also do something to improve the performance, the productivity and wages in low value added industries as well? And it seems to me that that's a pretty good point in terms of economic objectives, and also an important point in terms of social policy. So if I flipped the remarks I made about the US round, it would be that yes, university cities seem to be very good at generating high value added economic activity, but there's a kind of left behind element in large parts of the United States as well, which has been playing out in their politics now for a while and will almost certainly continue to do so for a very long while. So how do low value added sectors fit into a sensible policy strategy on this? And how does regional policy address that when some regions are different from others?
Well, I think you'll have picked up from what I said that the reason we have inequalities, regional inequalities, is because, as I said, cities, many of which were the sort of leading edge during the Industrial Revolution, and some have been able to reinvent themselves, and some have not been able to do so. And there are all sorts of reasons for that. And I think the only way that you can change that is by getting more high value added businesses into them. We've tried to do it for 70 years by either, but particularly by trying to just get employment there. I'm afraid it just doesn't get you anywhere. You know, if you just replace a booming industrial manufacturing sector with a lot of small service businesses, you do not increase the value added per capita of the region. Now, there is this argument about, well, isn't the right thing to do to try and increase the value added of the low value added businesses? I personally think that this is not the way to go. I mean, the point, you just have to look at what these low value added businesses are. And they're not, as some people seem to think, potentially a high value added business which are performing badly. That is a great mistake. They're not. They are types of businesses which it's inherent. I mean, they do a very important job, and you will need to keep saying that, but they are in areas where it is very, very difficult often to get high value added. So these are small retailers, news agents, hairdressers. Now, the point about these businesses is it's very difficult to get high value added, to make yourself different. If you just increase a bit their production efficiency, that will just be, competition will just compete that away. So there isn't really a strategy which says, look, just focus on the low value added businesses. You have to face up to the fact you've got to get into the high value added businesses. Now, there comes a point, and there's some very good work in America which shows this. If you have a core of really high value added businesses in a city, it actually pulls up the wages of the people in the low value added businesses. And this is just a competitive competition for the wages of the people. So you can find that hairdressers will just get paid more in America if they're in Boston than if they are in some city which is struggling. So I don't think there's a way of escaping the fact that you've got to create the high value added businesses. I think if you're going to do that, the first thing you have to do is try and get some kind of structure whereby you can devolve some powers from Westminster. I mean, it is a shocking story in Britain that we've been talking about regional devolution, but we still have we don't have basically a regional structure in which you can devolve things to. Now, there is an opportunity, I think, for the first time, because of the mayoral combined authorities, to use them as the bodies to which you devolve powers. And I think there are some very important powers that you could devolve to them in areas like skills, and also things like transport policy, and also use the Strength in Places funds to put more R&D into building up high-tech clusters in those mayoral combined authorities. So I think there are things you can do, very practical things to do, to create more high value added businesses in those mayoral combined authorities. And I think that's the way to go rather than trying to increase the low value-added businesses into high value-added businesses, or to do what I think has become a really very mistaken policy, which is this idea that by having transport links between these cities, somehow that's going to stimulate regional policy. It's based on that whole argument about transport between major cities is based on a complete misunderstanding of the situation in regions in Germany and Holland, where it's been argued because they have these links, that increases the wealth of the region. It turns out there's no more interaction, there's no more movement between cities in those countries than there is in Britain. So linking up the roads is not going to do it. You really have to focus on high value added businesses.
Can I ask about two members of the audience have raised COVID, and Mohammed Ali Nasser kind of wonders whether COVID threatens to bring us another lost decade, and how we should, and also more broadly, whether COVID is going to exacerbate the problem or become part of the solution. And Jonathan Haskell asked, I think, a similar question, in that he was noting that some of the businesses that are having to close, at least temporarily and perhaps permanently, hairdressers, restaurants, cafes, and so on, hotels, are actually quite low value added, low productivity industries. And I'm certainly not inviting you to kind of welcome economic dislocation. But there's a kind of broader way of thinking about it, which is that when one talks to business people about the productivity growth problem, they kind of point to the extraordinary technological revolution over the past quarter of a century and essentially insist that there can't possibly be a problem. Whereas, of course, there has been a problem for some reason in that technological revolution finding its way into what economists call technical progress, the kind of mysterious bit in the solo growth model that you were implicitly referring to earlier. But the work of Robert Gordon and others shows that sometimes it takes ages for technological changes to find their way through into really big shifts in production technology, in the way that businesses are organized in ways that improves their productivity. There are no silver linings to COVID, but could one of its long-term effects be a dislocation that makes the economy more productive because it makes us use the new technology in the ways that we are doing now, for example? And that may be nonsense, but if it isn't nonsense, are there things that government should do, not only here but elsewhere in the world, to make that an opportunity rather than just a dislocation?
I have to say, I think I don't think there are many upsides to the pandemic. I think the question is, the real issue is the one you've mentioned, which is how do you speed up the diffusion of these new technologies to businesses, and do so in a way that we can maintain our competitive advantage in world markets. Because this is where I think we again and again fail to understand that we're in the middle of a huge shift in economic activity across the world. And I think it's extraordinary how little attention has been paid to this. But we live in a world where, if you take the period since 1990, all the G7 countries, and you made this point at the beginning, all the G7 countries have been seeing declining rates of economic growth and economic productivity growth. At the same time, there's a group of countries which people refer to as the I6, which have been growing incredibly fast. That is China, India, Poland, South Korea, Thailand, and Indonesia, and they have grown dramatically fast. And these two lots of figures are connected. The reason we have slow rates of growth is partly because we're losing value added in our industries because we're competing against much better competitors. And this is one of the ways where I think neoclassical economists have not, I mean, they've constantly kept saying, look, our slow growth rate has nothing to do with foreign competition. And I think they say that because they're fearful that if you admit that, then immediately there will be protectionism. But the truth is, it has a lot to do, our slow growth rate has a lot to do with the fact that we are seeing lower value added in our industries because they're competing ever more with dynamic, innovating businesses from these other countries.
I think, I'm not a trade theorist, but I think at least some trade theorists would say that opening up to the rest of the world is certainly good for consumers as consumers because they can consume cheaper goods. But the impact on the productive part, hold on. The impact on the productive part of the economy will depend upon precisely the things that you are talking about. And there's one final set of issues. There's a final question, but there's a final substantive set of issues I wanted to ask about, which is both kind of micro and a kind of broader policy question, which is that, I mean, a few years ago, a spectacularly successful new technology company in Cambridge Arm was bought by the Japanese and is now potentially being sold, I think, to an American company by Mr. Sun at SoftBank. Is that the kind of thing that governments would rationally check or constrain in some way, and without at all getting into the kind of negotiation between the United Kingdom and the EU? Is state aid something that you think has a role to play, subsidies essentially, a role to play in achieving what you described? Because the other things you mentioned none of them are actually subsidies in the orthodox sense, and it's in some respects the most surprising part of the UK's economic debate is a shift to potentially embracing state aid within the rules of the WTO and so on. And I just, without putting this in an EU context, I wonder whether you thought that subsidizing particular industries can work over the medium to long run.
Well, to take the arms situation first, I actually think there is a rather strong case for stopping foreign companies buying up the high-tech businesses in one's own country, because that is your production facilities, and if you lose those, you're just less able to compete. So I'm, in the same way that I thought the bid for Pfizer for AstraZeneca was outrageous, and if we had lost that, we would have lost a very important part of our industrial structure. So on that, I think there is a very strong case. the question of subsidies, I think if you look at the question of the role of the state, what all the evidence says is there's a lot to be said for government supporting areas like education and training, supporting technologies for sectors, and indeed supporting sectors. The thing not to do is ever to get into supporting individual companies or supporting particular products, because there's no way government can ever know what is the right firm to support, or indeed the right product to support. But giving support to R&D for a particular industry like aerospace, and having projects to support it in some way, I think that all the evidence shows can be extremely helpful. And we're living in a world where other countries are doing it and doing it very successfully. And so I would be very supportive of that, just as long as you don't get involved in trying to support particular companies or products, because that you have to do that. You need a granularity of knowledge, which you simply will never find in government. But saying, look, we have a very good pharmaceutical industry, and we need to give it some incentives on purchasing its drugs for the National Health Service or whatever those sort of issues are, or making certain that there's very good public research in those particular fields, that makes eminent sense.
And I think, just to add to that answer, I think something else that could be said is that if one wants to provide subsidies, then it is vital to address the question of how to avoid all the problems that the public choice economists identified a quarter of a century ago from Chicago and Virginia, which is that even if the government of a particular period has a good policy on paper, sticking to that policy over time, given the nature of politics in the broadest sense, isn't at all easy. Josh Martin, I hope I've got his name right, correct, has asked, so we've been talking about productivity, but actually he asks which do we, but I think that means which do you think is the greater problem or puzzle, the lower level of productivity in the UK, or the slowdown in the rate of growth in productivity? And I think it's a good question to ask, because one's a kind of relative set of issues where productivity elsewhere is sometimes somewhat higher, whereas the other is, in degree at least, a shared problem across the Western world. I mean, I currently think that the productivity growth problem is the more pressing thing, but also it appears to be deeply intractable. And I'd like to link that to some questions that members of the audience have raised about manufacturing, and in a sense to give you an opportunity to say what you mean by high value added manufacturing, because as we have seen in a world of global supply chains and so on, as China has grown and wages have risen there, so manufacturing capacity has been moving to Vietnam, and as a few years ago, parts of it moved out of the United States to Mexico, or from Germany to parts of Central and Eastern Europe. In other words, I mean, Richard Baldwin writes about this incredibly eloquently in his last but one book. Global supply chains and the ability to manage them, and to manage distant productive capacity has actually made manufacturing productive capacity hugely more mobile than was the case then when we were young. And can the UK, even if we got everything right can we expect to get much of that into the UK, or is that a false way of thinking about it, as shown by the success of the semiconductor industry in the United States, Taiwan, telecoms in parts of Scandinavia, and so on? I think addressing that set of questions about, so what high-end manufacturing could the UK realistically aspire to in a world of mobile capital and global supply chains, is, I think, a pretty big question.
Well, I think the answer is, you come back to this issue of competitive advantage. Where are the places which we can do these things better than other people, and therefore produce a better product which we can charge more for, because other people can't do it. And that means it's got to be in pretty complicated, difficult areas of manufacturing. For example, aerospace, it does turn out to be very difficult to build up an aerospace company, because it does involve so many different suppliers, some very high-tech knowledge and so on. So we do, and the same is true of the drug industry. And we've just got to find these industries and push them very hard. And of course, we're doing so in the middle of a period where you've got Industry 4 coming along. Industry 4 is effectively the digitalization of manufacturing, which means one can very substantially increase its production efficiency. And unless we get our act together about diffusing the ideas of Industry 4 across the country, we're going to be out of manufacturing altogether. So, I mean, I think there's just a challenge here to get innovation diffused into manufacturing industry, so we can compete. And particularly that's going to be important in the really difficult industries, which not everyone can get into easily, like aerospace, artificial intelligence, and so on. And there's, I think, a whole area of pharmaceutical manufacturing, which also is potentially very difficult. And if we can use our real knowledge of biotechnology, also to put that into manufacturing of drugs and so on, then, and this is going to be actually a rather interesting and very difficult issue, because we're going to go into personalized medicine, and personalized medicine has all sorts of manufacturing issues. So I think there are opportunities, but you've got to get up the rate of innovation, and you've got to get up the, of course, hugely get up the level of skills of our workforce if you're going to do this.
Thank you very, very much, David. I'm going to wrap up our part of the conversation and hand over to Jagjit in just a second. I would just like to offer the following thought to everybody that's joined us this evening. And that's, for what it's worth, I think it's just tremendously refreshing to get through 45 minutes of discussion and 15, 20 minutes of David sharing his thoughts with us before that, without it centering on the two macroeconomic demand management institutions, the Treasury and the bank. In my professional youth, no debate about the economy got anywhere without people talking about the Treasury all the time. And then as I got older, people talked about nothing other than the Bank of England, as though the central bank could somehow be the solution to everything. I absolutely promise you, I don't know what they think of the central banks these days, but I can absolutely promise you that the late Eddie George, Mervyn King, myself, Charlie Bean, we thought absolute nonsense. I mean, all of the important things, all of the really important things lie elsewhere. And that that doesn't feature enough in our national debate. And I think that is a crisis of its own. And if you can help solve just that crisis, you will have enriched public debate and set us on a course to solving, I hope, some really serious problems. So thank you for agreeing to discuss this with me. I've really, really enjoyed it. Jagjit.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, David. I enjoyed that discussion tremendously. Thank you very much. We might have to think about a part 2 and 3 at some point in the future, but certainly a very wide-ranging discussion that has prompted me to think a lot about productivity. David was kind enough to mention the ESRC's new Productivity Institute that kicked off in September. And you'd be pleased to know, David, that the National Institute of Economic Social Research is helping to run 3 of the 8 themes at that institute. So even though it's based, and pleased that it's based in Manchester and corralling the work of 9 institutes around the country, the National Institute is playing a key role in that, with the leadership of Bart van Ark and Tony Venables, who've been on this call this afternoon as well. So I feel thoroughly stimulated to think harder about the questions that you've raised. And I think the one at the end, to me, is very clear. And that, I think you touched upon a little bit, to do with uncertainty and questions of people not quite knowing what government is planning. And I think that's something that's been revealed very much this year as well. I think the uncertainty induced by the lack of policy action is an ongoing problem in the British debate. I think we have a missing institution somewhere that forces people to think about the long run. We don't seem to have that, and we have policy that seems to vacillate just a little bit too often in this country, that doesn't help those planning for the long run. And some of that also interacts with the financial system discussion that we have. So I've learned so much from this evening. I want to thank you very much for making the time for us today. If I may just now, I'd like to turn to the vote of thanks that will come from Vivienne Prais, who is a long-standing friend of the Institute. I'll just wait for her to turn on her camera. Good evening, Vivienne. Very nice to see you again. If I may embarrass her somewhat, I just want to say that she's a lawyer of some standing. She studied at the LSE, as many of us did, but also at La Sapienza in Roma. And indeed, I think became a solicitor as I mean, it doesn't look true to me that it is true, but you say it's true, so it must be true, that you became a solicitor in 1970. And I think this year you got your certificate of congratulations for having been on the roll for 50 years. So I think that's a half century of being a solicitor. That's quite remarkable. But I think all I really need to do, Vivienne, is thank you very much on behalf of the Institute, but also on behalf of all the researchers from whom I've had so many messages in the past few days, who have such fond memories of working with SIG, some of them on the famous biscuit problem we talked about earlier on. And I think we should all feel glad to be, you know, in the shadow of his work in some sense. And I think you yourself have followed some of it up in your own work. So Vivienne, can I just thank you for joining us? Thank you for the family support for this lecture. But may I just turn to you at this stage, Vivienne?
Thank you. Lord Sainsbury, on behalf of the National Institute and all of those who've been listening to your lecture this evening, I would like to say a heartfelt thank you for delivering this 2nd annual Prais Lecture. I know that my husband would have been delighted that you agreed to speak to us, although he might have been somewhat startled by the medium through which your lecture was delivered. I should also thank you for your support for the National Institute over many years, and in particular, your support for Sigbert's work on productivity. I'm, as you will have realized from the introduction, I'm not an economist or a statistician or a social scientist, so some of what I heard tonight went over my head a little, but I was pleased to hear your final sentence, which included the phrase, levels of skill of the workforce, because that was very much what Sigbert was concerned with, and he did a lot of work, as you all know, on comparing training and productivity between Germany and the UK, and he was of course much impressed with the training of the workers in Germany. And purely anecdotally, I mean, I have been wondering as you were talking whether his work and the concept of the importance of the level of training was still relevant today. But purely anecdotally, I'd like to tell you my own experience recently. I went to visit a printing press in the south of England. For obvious reasons, I won't name the company, but they had vast printing machines in this plant. And I asked them where they got the machines from, some of them very advanced, and they said they came from Germany. And so, knowing about Sigbert's work, I asked them, well, how did they cope with the maintenance of the machines? and their answer was that they regularly had engineers coming from Germany to attend to that. And I thought it rather bore out what had been discovered by Sigbert over the years. It's still very relevant even today. But I'd like also to add here a personal thank you to the National Institute, those members of staff who have worked so hard to arrange this event, if I may. And now finally, I'm going to take part in another virtual activity, and that is to present I'll take it out of its case. This is a medal from the Institute commemorating for you, Lord Sainsbury. I don't know if you probably can't see it very well, but it says on the back, Lord Sainsbury, How to Solve the Productivity Puzzle, 10th November 2020. On the front, NIESR, Prais Lecture on Productivity. And you will be getting this not just virtually, but in reality very shortly. Thank you again for your lecture.
Can I thank you for that? Because as I hope I made clear in my opening remarks, it was something which really changed my view about technical education, that work comparing the factories. And I do hope that the scheme the government now has of creating T-levels and having a proper national system of qualifications really would meet what Sigbert wanted to have seen. It would take a long time to get up to the German standards, yes. But I think this is a lifetime, once in a lifetime opportunity to really build on what he started.
I'm very pleased to hear that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you, Vivian. Thank you, Paul, and everyone for joining us this evening. We will arrange the delivery of the medal in the next day or two. But as I said earlier, I very much enjoyed this evening. I want to thank you all for your contributions, and we will regroup next year for the 3rd annual Sig Prais Lecture on productivity. Thank you all very much. Goodbye.